Welcome to Plain Talk, and boy, we were all talking just before the show started here about what a time to be alive with all the things that are going on right now. I mean, it's nobody alive has lived through a political moment like this in the United States of America, where we have, an incumbent president of the United States, where there are real, legitimate, I'm not talking about like talk radio, cable news, hot air about somebody not being qualified, real, genuine, legitimate concerns about whether or not that person can fulfill the duties of their office. It's obviously was already a hugely contentious election, and now this got a lot more complicated. A little bit later in the show, we're actually going to be having a professor of American political history from Gannon University on. He recently had an article in the Washington Post called "Rural Voters Don't Trust Biden. Do Progressives Even Care?" And it's going to be interesting to talk about that in the context of what the performance that President Joe Biden just logged at the recent debate. But before we get there, we're going to be talking with North Dakota Attorney General Drew Wrigley about a number of issues. Drew, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you fellas?
Pretty good. Before we get into any of that, let's talk presidential politics for a moment. I know we've all been watching our governor make his case for being vice president. Have you had any conversations with him? How do you feel that's going?
Yeah, we've seen pretty close touch, actually. Actually, we spent most of yesterday in interviews and then selecting the new president for the Bank of North Dakota. And then after we had a chance to talk for a little while, and he's doing really well. I think whether somebody agrees with him or not, I happen to. I personally hope he's selected to be the vice presidential nominee, but that's someone else's determination. But when the governor is on talk shows or doing interviews or going through things, it's the same as talking with him in the hallway here. He's extremely consistent. He's I think that's why he comes across, and he is so unflappable, because he's not wavering around in the wind. He's got a strong perspective on the issues that he's having the opportunity to talk about on a national stage. And personally, I think it's helpful for North Dakota. And, he's a very, very sound and capable spokesperson and leader on these issues that are so centrally important to our state. So I think that it is an interesting time. I don't know that, certainly not in our lifetimes, and I'm older than you two, but in our lifetimes, there have been a North Dakota political leader who has been in the position that Doug Burgum has worked himself into today, to be on the verge of potentially being named the running mate, to be part of a national ticket, and in an election that is, here we are. We say it every time, but this is an important one. It's critically important how this turns out, and I would say whatever side of this coin people are on.
Drew, I wasn't planning on getting the presidential election, but you used a term that I don't often hear these days in describing Governor Burgum, and that's consistent. He's gone from "I would never do business with this guy" to "he's the greatest thing." We went from a January 6th was, an attack on our democracy to as a peaceful transfer of power. I would say, I don't know that I would use the word consistent, because when I have people ask me, and I get asked a lot, not a lot of people pay attention to North Dakota politics. So Doug Burgum is sort of, what would you say about Doug Burgum? I say, which one? Because I don't see that consistency. I see a real difference between the guy who came into office and what we've seen since he dropped out of the presidential race. But as long as we're talking about the governor, he recently referred to the current president as a dictator because of executive orders. Mm-hmm. Would you use the term dictator when describing Joe Biden? And isn't that a pretty dangerous term to start saying somebody's a dictator just because you disagree with them?
Yeah, I think it's political rhetoric, but it's something that we talk about routinely, and not just with the Democrat Party. Let's be honest. I'm somebody who's troubled by the overuse. Yeah, there are executive orders that are completely appropriate and are really just functions of carrying out your executive function. And then I would say that it's gotten to an extreme, and I think the public is getting more and more concerned about it. Sometimes not even just the substance of the issue that's being decided, but we feel like our government's being taken away from us, our elected officials. It's easy to talk to your member of Congress, your senator, or their staffs and try to move policy in this country. It's damn tough when you've got these king-like figures that are residing in the White House. And like I say, this isn't the first administration that's done that, but we've been extremely troubled, and we're involved in millions of dollars in litigation on behalf of the interests of North Dakota because of edicts and orders and executive action and administrative action coming out of this administration.
So I don't remember any Democrats saying Trump was a dictator when he was signing more executive orders.
I do. I do.
Dictator?
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah. Chad, I don't remember whether those exact words were used, but let's face it, we've gotten to a point in this country where everybody is just constantly just slashing at each other with razor blades. I think that's.
I remember when George W. Bush was being called a war criminal and a dictator and everything else too. So I mean,
and you know what? And my party's been guilty of it at times, and the others. I'm going to step back for a second though on Governor Burgum. I've known Doug I've known him 25 years probably, just personally. And then now worked with him extremely closely the last 2.5, but also in the years before when I was U.S. attorney, we had lots of opportunities to communicate about public policy matters in the state. I find him very consistent. Whether I'm talking to him, we were both kind of night owls. We got the full late at night or chatting about things or talking with him for an hour yesterday after the meeting. I think he's very, very consistent. I believe I have insight to what matters to that person. He cares passionately about things that matter centrally to North Dakota. Energy production, I can go through the list. I don't even have to because everybody knows what they are. I won't take a bunch of your time with them. I find it very consistent. What we do, though, right now, when we grab onto the use of a word here or use of a word there and we say, oh, they're inconsistent. And it's like, the three of us know each other. We can talk, have conversations about topics, probably feel like we could guess each other's views on a lot of different things. We might use different rhetoric, language, depending on are there other people around? Is our mom in the room listening to the language we're using at that moment? Or are we on a different trajectory? I think it's unfair to point to Doug Burgum and say, oh, now he's all Trumpy, but before that he was what? What was he before that? Like Hubert Humphrey? He is a practical thinking person. I've had a couple opportunities, a couple of national media people called me in the last few weeks to talk to me about him. And I find him easy to talk about because he is consistent. He is passionate about problem solving. He wants there to be a chord reached between stakeholders and reach resolution and make progress and move needles, but he will not back down. And I've loved his interview last week. He's not going to back down because somebody thinks that it's his job to have the media's perspective on everything that Donald Trump has done or said over the years. I'll just leave it there. I think that there are real policy disputes that matter in this country. Doug Burgum is squarely in the midst of it, and whether he's selected to be Donald Trump's running mate or if he's a very, very influential person in that campaign, and from my perspective, hopefully administration up ahead, North Dakota's interests are going to be served by that. In the nation's, because our interests are the nation's when it comes to agriculture, land use, oil and gas, you name it, technological advances in carbon capture and a host of other things related to energy. We're moving the needle in the state, and people in the state should be proud. Republicans and Democrats should be proud of policies we put in place to foster advancement in technology, and the region and the nation benefit. Minnesota doesn't want to.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that because you mentioned the North Dakota Industrial Commission. You mentioned carbon capture. Recently, the NDIC sent a letter to the state of Minnesota, essentially telling them they back off this law where you're going to essentially ban, fossil fuel imports into your state, which, I think Minnesota gets something approaching 70% of its energy from the state of North Dakota. So it's, essentially Minnesota's passed this law and they by, 2040, they have to have 100% of their energy from renewable resources. And they're not, and you're essentially asking them to consider, hey, carbon capture is something that's coming online. Open the door for this at the very least. And the interesting context to this is MISO, which is an acronym that stands for the Midwest or Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. Essentially, it's when we talk about the electrical grid, that's the electrical grid that serves Minnesota, also parts of North Dakota and like 13 other states, and I think one Canadian province. They came out recently and said, hey, we're shutting down too many power plants, and we're going to have shortages if we keep on this path. And by the way, they said shortages by
next year. So, I mean, that's some more context to where, Minnesota has set this policy agenda for itself, and the people who are tasked with, making sure that the energy that's produced reaches the people who need it are saying, hey, we're moving too fast. So speak to that a little bit about the industrial commissions. I mean, have you heard back from Minnesota at all, or
No.
Where is that at?
We haven't heard yet. Our letter is dated June 26th, and the industrial commission, myself, the governor, and the ag commissioner, Doug Goring, sent that letter to our counterparts, but also to the other the political leadership of Minnesota. And I want to make clear, we're not at war with Minnesota. We're not at war even with their statute, but we can be. We're prepared to be, and we will be if they proceed down a route to where they foreclose the discussion on their legislative objectives, and they can pass legislation and have goals and ideas about where they want things to move with regard to carbon production and the production of energy. But what we're saying is look at it all around, and we think that they are duty bound to consider carbon sequestration. I mean, that's an emerging technology. North Dakota is on the advanced edge of that. We've got the capacity, the ability, we've got the geology, and we've got the emerging technology, and we've got the pipelines, and we just got to get them sited, get them completed. But we're going to have the ability to sequester carbon. That's become a public policy objective in a lot of areas, and we're saying to them in that regard, to a degree, we're sharing that, and we're going to offset our carbon production for energy production that we're exporting to Minnesota. I would think that they could send us a thank you note instead of legislation that could be taken as hostile to the production of dependable, relatively inexpensive energy that keeps their people and our people alive. So our objective in all of this is to find out where we can mesh our the energy production in our state with their statutes and their goals and objectives up ahead, and perhaps we can. And we're imploring them to consider the whole picture, including the sequestration of carbon and the advancement of technologies, and don't be stagnant in your analysis. And by passing your legislation, basically be handcuffing energy producers around you that actually give you that energy. There's a lot of federal constitutional provisions that we believe preclude them from passing legislation that has extraterritorial impact, and including in this regard. So they haven't yet gotten to the point. I want to be fair to our counterpart. They haven't yet gotten to the point where they've shown hostility to our approach on this. This letter is part of a discussion. It's very thorough. It's very detailed. I want to thank very much the Industrial Commission staff and others who have worked so hard to put this together so that we can have that discussion. We're not yet at war with Minnesota. We don't wish to be. We are prepared to be. We can fund that battle. We believe we're on the legally correct side of it. And our hope is that they don't, it's not even them relenting. It's them just recognizing they have constitutional obligations. They also have energy needs that we are meeting, and that North Dakota's sequestration of CO2 should be taken in, it needs to be taken into account when you're looking at the carbon production that accompanies energy production in the state of North Dakota.
Drew, this is one of those conversations that, and I'm going to talk to our next guest about how these kind of conversations so negatively affect Democrats when talking about these issues. I believe that carbon sequestration has to be part of the mix if we're going to reach our environmental goals. As somebody on the left, I think the environmentalists need to figure out that this has to be part of the mix moving forward. You said you aren't at war yet. I struggle with, I'm going to try to get you to get in the heads of people on the left, but I don't understand why everybody's not embracing this technology, because it leads us to where we want to go. It reaches our environmental goals, and it creates a situation where coal and good union jobs in those coal plants stick around for a long time. So can you help me understand, is it just sort of like we talked about early, just like your side versus my side? So therefore if you like something, I'm going to automatically hate it, because I don't know any North Dakota Democrats who don't support, I shouldn't say that. most elected Democrats support carbon sequestration as a way to get our goal. But how do we get people in Minnesota and around the country to understand that so it's not a fight? Because this is such a win-win for everybody involved.
Boy, I think I should just say amen, because I agree with exactly how you articulate that. And it is a win-win. That people might have different incentives. There are very positive economic incentives to sequestering that. If you want to just look at it and say, well, there's tax incentives to do it. You can make, it's a product, it's a commodity. You can make money by sequestering into the ground. But then look up around the curve a little bit and recognize there's enhanced oil recovery. Oil recovery can be dramatically enhanced by utilizing the CO2, pumping that down into the cavernous earth where we're fracking the shale and drawing out the oil. The recovery is enhanced dramatically. We've seen that's being done now, and it's going to be improved technology going forward. So we're going to have that utilization as well, and it's being sequestered in the ground instead of going off into the atmosphere. People might differ about, well, what are the relative merits of it going into? Look, it's decided. The governor points out all the time, capital is moving towards companies that are advancing this technology and that are moving this direction. So that's an economic incentive. It's a recognition that there's benefit to sequestering it now. There's benefit to up around the corner, utilizing it to capture more and more oil out of the Bakken and other oil fields like it. And it does go to the point that some people just want to be at war because they see someone on the other side of it. I acknowledge I can be an abrasive person. I can be combative at times and everything else. And maybe I'm getting old, but you get to the point where you realize there are solutions that can be win-win if everybody doesn't just insist on, no, I have to win all of this, and whatever's left over, you can get a little bit.
The headline for this podcast coming out is Attorney General admits he can be a little crotchety. Just
and he's getting older.
And he's getting older.
The nature. Yeah, it's the nature of the work. Well, my point is just I'm not afraid of some combat. I just don't embrace it as a way of life. That's not our objective. We want to find resolution. That's what this letter's about. And I've met Keith Ellison, my counterpart across the river, only once. We were at a 3-day conference together, and we had a long conversation. I think we pretty quickly figured out maybe we wouldn't be talking about politics a whole bunch. We talked about our families. We talked about our lives and careers, and he's extremely personable, engaging fella who I look forward to having these discussions with him. We don't have to have our states utilizing precious public resources on a battle that we're joining just because of the point that Chad makes, just because, well, there's another side to this. I think this can be win-win. I believe we can find accord going forward. And the beneficiaries will be the states of North Dakota and Minnesota, people in the region. And then, you know what? I'm still old-fashioned. People can look up and recognize, like, wow, states with different politics are finding their way through some challenging circumstances, and not everything has to be a lawsuit. Because I'll tell you, we spend an enormous amount of money around here. We feel that we don't have a choice right now. We've got to be litigating these matters where, in many instances, the federal government they are violating existing federal law. It couldn't be more clear. We have to push back against that on the part of our energy and agriculture producers and others. But what I've been talking about lately with my AG counterparts around the country is I want to go into an era where instead of we just wait around until something noxious comes out of DC, whatever party's doing it, and then we're just going to bring a lawsuit. And we're going to put out a press release. We're going to have a big lawsuit. We'll have a big fight, and we'll look like we're a fighter. I want to get to the point where we're putting together delegations of attorneys general and our relevant staff in that instance, and going out to meet with agency heads or the administration and trying to avoid litigation on the front end, letting them know that, hey, we know that, let's say whatever your party, we're not in charge of the White House right now. Our party isn't there, but we do think if we could reach the following accommodations, we could avoid litigation up ahead. We can get to the point where, that elections matter. Elections matter, but they shouldn't draw every damn battle line. And it's like, well, now that's over. We got to go 4 more years.
We got to end this thing where every election has a swing from one side to the other. We need some stability. And there's a quote from Game of Thrones that I love, which is essentially you can only make peace with your enemies, right? Which is not to say that we want to characterize the people on the other side of these debates as enemies per se, but you can only compromise with people you disagree with. That's it. So let's move on. we saw a plea in the Holmberg trial. And my question for you is, obviously that's all being handled in federal court, although your office, or BCI, had a lot to do with the investigation. My question for you, though, is what does that mean for open records that we may not have received yet? I know that some of them were maybe tied up because they were part of the criminal proceedings, or at least potentially part if they'd gone to trial. I realize, I mean, the plea's entered, it's not done yet, but are we going to see another influx of records be available once that's concluded?
You are. When it's concluded, and assuming that it goes forward as planned, Holmberg and his attorney have notified the United States that they are going to change his plea to guilty, and then that's to be scheduled. It's August 8th. Where that's scheduled to take place. Assuming that does happen, then they'll go forward and they'll have a sentencing date in the months that follow after an extensive investigation. When it's all concluded and there are no appeals pending, these matters, everything in our custody here in the state becomes an open record, all of it. There's some redactions that have to take place, but I've made clear from the beginning that this investigation, it is a matter of very significant public concern and attention. I've been in and out of this work for 30 years. There's never been a case that had more, not only public interest, public consequence. And the public, probably today, thinks that they know a lot about what's going on with this, and some people have drawn conclusions. And I've heard, I've taken plenty of 2 irons to the shin on this and associated matters, but I stand firmly where we are, and it's going to, there's going to be more public information coming out, and that's my pledge. I not only will put out every scrap of paper that we possibly can, everything that is in our possession, in possession of the BCI, is going to be treated as a public record, and it will be going out with redactions that are required by law. And then I will personally sit and explain everything that I possibly can in answering people's questions, because serious public policy implications are there, serious internal policy things internal to the legislature, to that process. Obviously, most consequentially, serious personal conduct that they've signaled they're going to be pleading guilty to. And I'll say this, the public does not yet have any sense of the breadth and depth of what's going to be coming out.
So, Rob, did you have a question?
One follow-up on that. Like, are you going to be, because normally how it works is if something becomes an open record, it doesn't just automatically get dumped on the public. Somebody, a journalist or just a member of the public, has to put in a request for it. Given that this is such an unusual situation, are you just going to proactively just release that stuff in some way, or how is that going to work logistically?
I am. Yes, I'm going to proactively. We've done the same along the way here with the issue of the emails that were deleted under my predecessor administration. We've done that. We're going to do that here. We're going to find a way to, I'm not going to sit and play games with, well, they didn't ask the question. They didn't ask for this. They didn't ask for that. The entire swath of the information that can be made available will be. And I'll stand to answer questions where we can, because that investigation has been very largely run by the BCI, which I am proud to have the opportunity to oversee. And in conjunction with federal law enforcement, the United States Attorney's Office has done an extraordinary job. They have worked assiduously on this. I've told you folks before, in my very first hour after being sworn in, I was summoned by the U.S. Attorney's Office. They needed to talk to me, and they told me about this investigation. And we went from there, because they said it's your BCI that's doing that. I'd say, the vast majority of it, but really hand in glove. HSI has been very, very involved in other federal agencies, and then all under the watchful eye of the United States Attorney's Office and the prosecutors there. So I'm going to be proactive about that, and we'll answer questions as they go along, and people will not have to hope that reporters, because it's tough. It's needle in a haystack. How would you know even what questions to ask if you don't know what avenues you're going to go down? So yes, to answer your question, the entire swath of the information is going to be public.
Drew, I've been a little surprised by former Senator Holmberg, obviously accused of raping children and now is pleading guilty to raping children, that he did not become like an instant sort of, like, people still were talking to him. Like, does it surprise you that he wasn't sort of made some sort of, like, I'm just surprised that he stayed sort of in the circles and he was, still having dinner with influential people and those kind of things. Did that surprise you? Because so often when somebody does anything that's somewhat unethical or whatever, like everybody's running away from them. In this situation, it didn't seem like people ran away from him. And this is probably an unfair question, Drew. I realize that, but I've just been sort of surprised for how much this has been in the press that people weren't like, holy cow, this guy's accused of what? I want nothing to do with that guy anymore.
Yeah, I'm not going to differ very much with you on that. It's been a little surprising, but people, and they're right. Everybody's entitled to their day in court. He's entitled to make his decision about whether he's going to plead guilty. He's signaled that he's going to through his counsel, and if that comes to pass on August 8th, there'll be more public awareness as of that day, because there'll be some significant detail as part of the colloquy, we call it, where the United States, Jennifer Poole, the first assistant United States attorney, will go through and a recitation of the facts that would be proven at trial. But it will not be the entirety of the swath of the conduct and provable conduct that will be relevant for sentencing. And then when she has the sentencing hearing, again, assuming this all goes forward as is currently indicated, there will be a wide swath. I keep using that word, but there will be a wide swath of information that she will be asking the court to take into consideration, because it is provable conduct. And I point out too, there are capable counsel on both sides of this. Jennifer Poole is no other word for it. She is an extraordinary talent and energy as a federal prosecutor. And former Senator Holmberg's attorney, Mark Freese, is an extremely capable advocate and defense lawyer and capable professional person. Little backstory: the two of them, they were in law school together. They clerked together in the North Dakota Supreme Court. I wouldn't describe them as fishing buddies today. Those things happen across the years, but I know there's tremendous respect back and forth. And I'll just say that the public's interest is being served when there's super capable counsel on both sides of that equation.
Yeah, that's exactly what we want. Well, Drew, I think we're all out of time, so thank you so much for coming on and taking our questions.
Thanks to both of you, and have a good 4th to you and to your listeners, and we'll see you up ahead as these things all continue to blossom.
The cold cases you see at The Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At The Vault Podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome back. Just finished up with Attorney General Drew Wrigley, and some very interesting things he had to say, particularly about what we may be seeing as open records become available after Senator Holmberg's prosecution. But we're going to switch gears here. Our guest now is Professor Jeff Bloodworth. He is a professor of American political history at Gannon University in Pennsylvania, which is actually where Chad is right now. We didn't plan that at all, but Chad's in Pennsylvania right now. 2 guests in Pennsylvania. Anyway, the headline for the piece was "Rural Voters Don't Trust Biden. Do Progressives Even Care?" But really, it's not just the article. I think is much, or the discussion I think that it evokes is much larger than just this presidential race, which I will tell you now looks very different than it did when I first booked this interview, given the recent debate performance by President Biden. But it's really about how Democrats kind of lost rural America, and obviously you're talking about rural America. North Dakota is a big part of that. And North Dakota also, I think, an interesting case study, because not so long ago, our entire congressional delegation was Democrats. And as a matter of fact, the last statewide office the Democrats held was a U.S. Senate seat the Democrats had held since, I think, the Eisenhower administration. I mean, they had held it for a long time. So North Dakota is a place that for many, many years has not had problem voting for Democrats. And at times, voting for Republicans and Democrats on the same ballot in large landslide numbers. So I think this is and I feel like every election cycle comes around, I'm interviewing Democratic candidates and I'm asking them, how are you finally going to connect with rural voters? And I don't know that any of them really have a good answer. So maybe, Professor Bloodworth, you can help us find that answer. What happened to Democrats in rural America?
Well, it's both deep roots and really contemporary roots as well. I'm writing a biography on Carl Albert, who was Speaker of the House in the 1970s, Majority Leader during the 60s. He's from rural Oklahoma, and I've started doing a lot of political journalism over the last 2 or 3 years. The deep roots are that urban, educated liberals, starting in the 1960s, took over the Democratic Party. And they started booting out working class Democrats. And the Democratic Party is a reflection of a highly educated kind of urban milieu. But that's a long process. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton won, in about 49% of the rural vote in 1996. He outpaced Bob Dole by several percentage points. And so Democrats were still holding their own in rural America. The irony is that, Obama, who targeted particular rural districts in Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, and Indiana, he won those states because he did pretty well, right? He didn't win a majority, but he did pretty well with certain pockets of rural voters in 2008. And after 2008, what I found in my reporting by talking to strategists and people on the ground is that Democrats got fat and happy, and they quit showing up. And they started getting pasted in rural America. And then this belief has emerged amongst highly educated urbanites who run the party that those people in rural America will never vote for Democrats. I mean, North Dakotans know that's not true. But this is hardened into conventional wisdom, again, with, a subset of people, right? Highly educated urbanites who don't have any rural roots or rural family, and they stereotype rural America. I mean, to me, it's kind of hard to believe, but when I started talking to different strategists and candidates, they all kind of echoed the same story of a national party, maybe not state parties and maybe not county parties, but a national party that is out of touch with its rural voters, and it's run by people who don't think Democrats can be competitive in rural America.
So one of the things that I, thinking specifically about North Dakota, I was the executive director of the Democratic Party. My dad was a Democratic legislator. My wife was a Democratic legislator. I now work for a union in North Dakota. And often when people say, what happened in North Dakota, I will say, well, the rural white folks ran away from the Democratic Party, and North Dakota is nothing but rural white folks. I mean, it's not that surprising. Yeah. I think the other thing at play, and I'd like your sort of take on this, is the nationalization of our elections. When we had Kent Conrad, Byron Dorgan, and Earl Pomeroy representing us in Congress, when people thought of Democrats in North Dakota, they thought of those three guys. They didn't think of the president or Nancy Pelosi or whatever. But with the advancement of talk radio, with the advancement of social media, cable news, everything is nationalized now. So a Democrat in a rural place can't sort of break away from that sort of stuff. What's your take on sort of the nationalization and what that's meant for rural Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally correct, right? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why Democrats are not competitive. And we have, sadly, right, to everybody's detriment, nationalized our politics. And it makes it harder to be a North Dakota Democrat or a Mississippi Democrat. And that's most certainly true. I in Mississippi in 2023, I went down and I covered the governor's race in Ruby Red, Mississippi. Brandon Presley came within about 26,000 votes of winning. Why did he lose? He lost. And again, I got this from a former two-term party chair of Mississippi. Instead of mobilizing Mississippi grassroots volunteers to canvass and to get out the vote, they hired a bunch of people from Ohio, right? And it's just like they don't have the accent. They don't understand the rural roads. They don't understand the norms and rules. And Brandon Presley should have won that race. But they had bad turnout, especially among African-American voters. And so you were correct in all of that. Talk radio, has kind of tilted the playing field against Democrats, the demise of small newspapers. Sure. Right. I mean, all of that is totally real. and it makes it harder for Democrats. But, you can't win if you don't even try to compete. And, and I don't know what that means for a state like North Dakota. Maybe we'll never see an all-Democratic kind of legislative team from a state like North Dakota, at least in the near future. But, Democrats, Brandon Presley should be the governor of Mississippi today. And that would mean Obamacare, because a lot of Republicans who control the legislature wanted to expand Obamacare. I mean, tens of thousands of Mississippians would have health care today if the National Democratic Party, the DNC, came in and took over that race, and they screwed it up. And somebody, I'm not professionally hurt by saying these things. I have tenure. And so I decided that I just don't care.
How much of it? I remember like around the time that Barack Obama won in 2008, as a conservative, I was watching a lot of my Democratic friends talk about demographics as destiny, and it just seemed like they didn't have to bother with places like North Dakota anymore, because the decline of the white voter share of the electorate was declining. And they just assumed that all these other voting demographics, whether it's Hispanics, blacks, that were growing, they weren't going to vote Republicans. Therefore, Republicans would. I think James Carville had a book out that was like the 100-year Democratic minority or a majority. I mean, remember, like Barack Obama did not have a good midterm in 2010. Right. I mean, it didn't last 2 years, or it did last 2 years. It lasted exactly 2 years. So I guess is that part of it too? It just seemed like Democrats convinced themselves that they didn't have to worry about white rural voters anymore.
You're totally correct. The person who wrote the Emerging Democratic Majority and had that thesis, Rui Teixeira, has now said
repudiated it.
Repudiated it because the highly educated liberals, right, who all went to the same fancy schools, they believe that black and brown and Asian voters are going to vote for Democrats out of some sort of racial solidarity rather than out of pocketbook concerns and cultural issues. I mean, Trump is making inroads with Hispanic voters and Asian voters and African American men. But you're totally correct. I mean, the National Party, again, it's the National Party. This is not the state parties. It's not even every county party, but the National Party. And I've been told this again and again. I mean, they only got around to appointing, the DNC, a person to run kind of rural outreach for the 24 election last week. It's just political malpractice. I mean, you're totally correct. After 2010, they disbanded. The House and the Senate had a kind of an envoy to rural America to recruit House and Senate candidates and to help them run their campaigns. They got rid of both of those offices after 2010. Yeah, they got high on their on their own rhetoric, and they forgot that Barack Obama won in 2008 because they organized and they worked and they talked to people, and Obama was competitive in North Dakota. And
I think that's such a good point. I mean,
he was mid 40s. What is he, 44, 45%?
Not only that, but why was he in mid 40s? It's because he invested staff. There was staff in every corner of North Dakota in 2008. And so it was because they were going and talking to people and making sure they understood, what Barack Obama stood for, not just this sort of D versus R scenario. But I think Barack Obama plays an important role in this shift, right? I mean, we started to see this sort of 2009, 2010 Tea Party sort of people pushing back on maybe things moving a little faster than people in rural areas were comfortable with. What is your take on sort of Democrats' focus on social issues around LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, in how does race play a factor in all of this as well? Because so often we think about rural as being rural white, right? But it's not just rural white, except for in a place like North Dakota, it's rural white. So tell me how you think race plays a factor in that, sort of the Democrats' focus on really important social issues. And, they're basically saying we need to move on these LGBTQ issues. We need to move on these other social issues. People who aren't, wanting to move this quick, screw them. We don't need them. Can you just talk a little bit about how race and those kind of things play a role in this?
Yeah, it is. Again, this is not every Democrat, but I'm a professor, so I swim I live in a very, very blue world. And so, and where it is conventional wisdom, right? And it's the same world of these highly educated professionals who live in urban areas, who run the party, and they give money to the party, and they run for office. They are convinced, despite the evidence of 2008, when Barack Obama, won a series of majority white states. I mean, they are convinced that the backlash against Barack Obama was based on race, and I'm sure some of it was, but I think they vastly overstate that. In terms of LGBTQ issues, Democrats have lost the mainstream. When Democrats were the party of gay marriage, most Americans agreed with that. When Democrats became the party of drag queen story hour, that's when they lost mainstream America. People like my mom, she grew up in a world in which she didn't know anyone who was gay or lesbian. But something like a drag queen, to her, that is it's avant-garde. It's threatening to her. And she's a very normal American. And highly educated professionals who go to drag shows for fun, even if they are straight, they just don't understand that. There is a vast cultural gulf separating highly educated urbanites from what I call normal Americans. And I say this as a highly educated urbanite who was raised by rural people, who lived, in the Ozarks, rural adjacent. I'm writing a biography of somebody from Bug Tussle, Oklahoma. So it's strange. Like, I'm as close as you get in higher education with someone with rural roots. And my claim to rural roots is pretty tenuous, but I'm related to a lot of people from rural America, and I've spent time there, and I know that they're complicated, and they're not that different from urban America. They are very different, as most Americans are, from the highly educated kind of progressive elite who live in the 25 largest city and all go to the same 30 or 40 top schools. Those people, right, who have an enormous amount of influence and power culturally and politically, there's a vast gulf between them and normal Republicans and normal Democrats.
Barack Obama got 44.5% of the vote in North Dakota in 2008. He got 141,403 votes, which is unthinkable. I mean, Joe Biden's not going to get anywhere close to that in this, assuming Joe Biden's still on the ballot. That's
the Democratic president's campaign will be lucky to break 30.
Yeah.
Lucky.
Yeah. It's North Dakota's a very different place than it was in 2008. But one of it is, I remember, Barack Obama saying, after he won, it almost seemed like Obama kind of abandoned his own pragmatism, because we started hearing things like his rebuttal to Republicans is like, I won. And I'm just going to do this, and we're just going to start imposing this on you. And I think your argument that it was just going a little too fast, I think I understand that that's hard for people to grasp. Like if you're a person in the LGBTQ community and you're saying, oh, we're moving too fast towards treating you like equitably under the law, I understand where that's hard to hear, but there's certain political pragmatisms, political realities at play here where you're not going to get any progress if you can't win elections. And Democrats right now can't win elections in places like North Dakota, and thus are struggling to advance agenda nationally. So, I mean, how do I guess this leads to my question is, how do people who see this as a problem make their voices heard within the Democratic Party and get them to turn and start caring about this parts of the world that look like North Dakota again, or at least vote like North Dakota?
Losing is the best teacher. I mean, my first book was at the Democratic Party in the 1970s and 80s, and they only returned to the center via Bill Clinton after a generation of getting their butt whipped.
Okay, but let me rebut that a little bit, because let me quote from your article. Okay. It said the percentage of rural voters identifying as Democratic fell from 45% in 2008 to 36% in 2016. During the Obama presidency, Democrats lost 13 seats in the Senate, 69 in the House, 11 governorships, 913 state legislative seats, and 30 state legislative chambers. That's a lot of losing. What did they learn from that?
Very true. They held on to the presidency. They have extraordinarily narrow margins after 18 in the House, very narrow margins in the Senate. I mean, what losing would be getting locked out of the White House and not having control of Congress. I'm not predicting that. Donald Trump is very unpopular, and the Democrats struggled to beat him. And to me, I find that just Democrats don't understand the lesson that Donald Trump's unpopularity with the wide swath of Americans, Democrats can't beat that. And what they don't understand, because party elites live in a bubble, right? So they live in a bubble and they don't know anybody who disagrees with them. So, I mean, how do you break through and convince people to care about rural voters again? Losing is the best teacher. There are, I should say, a series of rural Democrats who are running grassroots campaigns in North Carolina and Mississippi and elsewhere. There are people on the ground in these states who are trying to redress these problems, kind of the national party notwithstanding. You might see a breakthrough. There is a 25-year-old state party chair in North Carolina. Clayton Anderson is her name, and her whole kind of reason for being the state party chair is grassroots organizing in rural North Carolina, because that's what's going to make Democrats, competitive and being able to win more races in a state like North Carolina. So there are kind of green shoots of individuals who understand that. The national party, however, I don't have a lot of hope, because it's all the same people from all the same schools, from all the same kind of urban milieu. They don't want to see it. It's just easier to stereotype rural voters, right? Because they don't go there, they don't know anyone who's from there, and they just kind of shrug their shoulders.
So, Jeff, I should just speak for listeners. I mean, I do know some folks who work at the DNC in high positions who didn't go to Ivy League schools or went to state schools in the Midwest. So I just want to throw that out there.
Okay.
One of my frustrations was sort of, and I don't think it's just the DNC. I think it's also the interest groups and all that sort of control the DNC.
The professional campaign apparatus.
Yeah. Right. One of the things that frustrates me is the inability to count to 60. Because at the end of the day, if you really want to move this country in a certain direction, you need to get 60 seats in the Senate. You cannot get to 60 seats in the Senate without places like North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, and some of those places being competitive. I mean, you'll recall, it wasn't just Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan. It was also Tim Johnson, Tom Daschle, and the two Montana senators, and Ben Nelson in Nebraska. I mean, you can go down the list. The only one left is John Tester in Montana, and that may be short-lived. I mean, sort of looking at the map moving forward. So I understand the idea. I believe in organizing. I believe in people being in every state and building up party and selling. But there's finite resources. Like how do you get the donor class to understand this has to be a long strategy, right? North Dakota didn't become where North Dakota is today in one election cycle, right? It was a cycle after cycle after cycle. But it's easier said than done to say we need to, invest in North Dakota when we're also, losing in places that we should be winning in. So how do you make the case to donors that we need to invest in the long game? I think you made the case about talk radio and how Republicans did such a great job of investing in them. The Dems were like, whatever, let it go. But how do you convince the donor class that this has got to be a long-term investment? It can't just be, for the next 5 months or 4 months or whatever it is before the election.
It's a great question, because, if you have, how many highly educated professionals have the Act Blue app on their phone, and they'll watch MSNBC or listen to NPR, and they'll get angry, and then they'll send money to a Senate candidate in South Carolina or Kentucky who doesn't have a heck of a lot of chance to win, instead of, I don't know, what Jane Klebe in Nebraska told me. If I had, 4 staffers for the state. I'm sure it's the same thing in North Dakota. If you just had a handful of paid staffers, you could become competitive. I think you need party leaders, right? Stating things as such. You need political journalists, right? In the New York Times, the Washington Post, people on NPR. I mean, it can't just be one person, but it has to be a wide network of folks, kind of basically political literacy 101, as we've kind of democratized how we fund campaigns, right? And now it's tens of thousands of people sending $50, $100, right, here and there. These are not necessarily people who fully understand that you need 60 Senate seats. It's not enough to have 51, right?
Or not even. You need 55 Senate seats, and then maybe 5 Republicans elected in states that are really scared of losing and are going to come to the table.
Yeah. I mean, and so and again, people are busy. They don't necessarily know like how the Great Society was passed. I mean, there were huge Democratic margins in the House and the Senate in the night, and then that's what you need. Republicans the same way to get to pass. If Trump wins to pass his agenda, he will need large margins. Republicans have always been more unified than Democrats, and so probably their margins need to be less healthy than Democratic margins. But I think it has to be educating the average person who gives $50 or $100, and that's tens of thousands, of the long game. Instead of giving money to a Senate candidate who's probably not going to win in Kentucky, give it to a state party chair so they can hire a staffer. Maybe that's what state party chairs need to start doing, is getting onto Act Blue, help a GoFundMe for staffers in rural states, because that's how Democrats can become competitive. And it's unhealthy for Republicans when they don't have good competition. You know that, Rob. Whenever you don't have good competition with the other party, iron sharpens iron. I'm sure.
Well, they start to become decadent, and they start to indulge some of their worst tendencies, and that's not a good thing. It's funny what you said too about the media, because I think it can't be just outside of the party. I talk with a lot of national media people who come to North Dakota because they reach out to me and they want phone numbers and the lay of the land and stuff like that. And their stories, so often, it's like reading Joseph Conrad, and they're talking about the Aborigines on their way up the river into the heart of darkness. It's like, we're part of America too. And also, when you go back to New York and you write this article, we read it. We can see what you're writing. It's not like where only a few people in the state had to go down to the library to read the New York Times or something. I could just pull it up on my phone. I see what you're saying about us. Like, come on. You have to understand us better than this.
Yeah, I would also add one other thing in terms of progressives in this country. They need to show Democrats in red states some grace, right? You're not going to get somebody better than Joe Manchin in West Virginia. You're just not. Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota.
Or Kristen Sinema in Arizona, by the way.
Yeah, right? I mean, so they vote wrong on one gun bill or something like wrong in the opinion of the progressives, and they're just like, we got to get rid of these guys. They're a dino or whatever. Well, the reality is they're going to be replaced by a very, very conservative person. So again, maybe it's the education of people understanding the reality of these states. I talk to many people about North Dakota, and they're like, well, how red is it really? And I'll say our Senate is 43-4. That's not Arizona red. That's a different color of red, right? And so getting progressives to understand the reality of this part of the country and what people are going through and what they care about seems to be something that I think you're sort of making the case that the elites don't care about that, but then we get what we get.
Yeah. In graduate school, I had a friend who was from rural Iowa, and we used to joke about starting a Democrat boot camp where we would bring kind of national Democrats to rural America and, show them how to go mudding, right? Take them to shoot a gun, go fishing. I mean, there's this wide cultural gulf. People know what they know. And the problem, and again, my own stepdaughter, she goes to a fancy private college in Philadelphia, great kid. I love her boyfriend, wonderful. When we visit them, I hear, the echoes of all of this, these beliefs that they have about rural Pennsylvania, and the litmus test of what it means to be a liberal. Somehow you can't be pro-life and a liberal. I mean, that's not the world I grew up in. I mean, I remember that there were lots of Democrats who were pretty liberal on a lot of economic issues.
I remember that Barack Obama's official position on same-sex marriage was he was against it until 2012 when he was reelected.
Yeah. I mean, these litmus tests are just, Republican or Democrat. I mean, being a moderate, which I'm a moderate. This is somehow in academia, I'm seen as like, an apostate. I'm basically a right winger because, I'm a Harry Truman Democrat, whatever that means anymore. And I mean, but this is, we think about the university is a problem in higher education, in the humanities, there's almost zero intellectual diversity. And it's little wonder that so many college graduates come out with a very stilted worldview of kind of what it means to be a liberal, and
then also like how effective Republicans have been at turning the campus into the Democratic Party writ large. Like, look at this crazy stuff that's happening on this college campus. These are who the Democrats are. We're defining all of them that way. And even though that's not fair, and not any more fair than some rando MAGA person at a Trump rally saying stupid things in a social media video, is not the Republican Party writ large. But this is what we're doing to each other too. We're defining each other by our extremes. We're up with time. I want to end with a funny anecdote. You guys might like this. So way back in the dawn of my political writing career, when I was a blogger, one of the first cool things that happened to me is I'd been writing a little bit about Walmart, and they were going through a thing with the unions and this card check thing and all that. And Walmart actually reached out and invited me down to a press thing in Bentonville, Arkansas, right? And I was just some dude with a blog in North Dakota, right? I am absolutely tickled by this. So my wife and I drive down there. We decided to make a road trip out of it. We drive down to Bentonville, and we pull up in front of our hotel, and across the street is a Fuddruckers. And we were so excited. We're like high-fiving each other. We're going to be eating good tonight. We like Fuddruckers, right? The next day, I go out, I get on the bus. I am so intimidated because there's people there. They have name tags, and it's like Reuters and the Associated Press. Michael Barbaro from the New York Times was there. I mean, so I'm walking down this aisle, and I'm looking. It might say there's a blogger from North Dakota, right? And so I sit down, and I think it was like the Washington Post reporter talking to like a Reuters reporter, and they're looking out the window at Fuddruckers. And one of them says, "Oh my God, what even is Fuddruckers? Like, who would even go there? How disgusting is that?" And I'm like, man, I had it last night. It was pretty good.
It was delicious.
So when you talk about like that culture, and listen, people have different tastes or whatever. I'm not here to judge. I'm not saying my tastes are better than yours, but could you just stop looking down your nose at me? Could you just do that? I would appreciate that. I'm tired of that stuff. Anyway, I wanted to end there. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. Final thoughts.
I greatly appreciate being on. I think North Dakotans deserve a healthy two-party competition. This is not healthy for anyone, either party, for the Democrats to be wholly uncompetitive in large swaths of America. And it's terrible that for Democrats, right, where Republicans aren't competitive in cities, we need to return to kind of moderate Democrats and liberal Republicans and in two-party competition everywhere. Iron sharpens iron. Sometimes conservatives are right on issues, right? And this is something that liberals used to understand and no longer do.
Well, you want to wonder why we're not sending our best and brightest to elected office anymore. This discussion is why.
But I also think this discussion is so important. I mean, Jeff, I appreciate you coming on. And I think as somebody who's left of center, it frustrates me that, I mean, in the previous conversation, we were on with the Attorney General talking about the coal industry in North Dakota. And, Democrats generally supported the coal industry. And I think most North Dakota Democrats still support the coal industry because they understand the good jobs or whatever. But the national sort of rhetoric around it, we can't even have like a conversation about how do we continue to turn on the lights in this country without it being some sort of partisan fight. And so I think putting the mirror back on Democrats a little bit on how we sort of, I think it is flyover country, all that other stuff, but we really need to figure out how we're talking about things and talking about, the way we demonize Trump voters and not try to understand why they're angry. Why do they feel the way they feel is a big mistake for us as people who are left of center. So I appreciate the article. I appreciate you coming on, and this conversation is wonderful.
The cold cases you see at The Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At The Vault Podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, just finished up with Professor Bloodworth, which, Jed, I think you really put it well. That is such a needed conversation. And again, I mean, I always say, like, I'm not out here, like, rooting for Democrats to win elections. I am rooting for Republicans to sweat, though. Like, I want them to be nervous. I want them to feel like they could lose, because if they feel like they can do whatever they want and they're not going to lose, it breeds problems. It breeds extremism. Right. It breeds corruption.
And I think Democrats in the country need to be thinking about, they don't have to win these rural areas. They're not going to win these rural areas. But you start moving the needle by 5 points in all these rural areas around the country, it elects, a Democrat president. It elects Democrat senators. I think a lot about people like Steve Bullock, who's the governor in Montana, and people would ask him, how did you win in such a red state? And he would always say, I showed up. It's really not exceptionally complicated, right? You got to show up in these communities. And sometimes you got to be willing to talk to people where they're at, and they might disagree with you, but they appreciate you showing up and showing like you understand, you care about their communities.
Yeah, I think that's it. Let's talk a little bit. I did want to just wrap up, because we talked about that remarkable debate last week. We were on right after it, and it's something that you and I both said. I think you said that the way the Biden administration or the Biden campaign, sort of addresses that debate performance is they get the candidate out on the stump and they get him doing interviews and taking questions and proving that he's not like that all the time. My argument was, I don't think they can. And I think we're both right. And we're looking at now, they haven't done anything, Chad. I mean, they have not done the thing.
He had the speech the next day in North Carolina at a rally where he was pretty strong, but not spectacularly strong.
Also reading off a teleprompter, right. Not taking live questions from reporters.
Right. And then he's at the White House last night, I think, or the day before, did a statement on the Supreme Court. Again, from a teleprompter, not that strong. Also, the reports of him not talking to Democratic governors or congressional leadership about their concerns, it doesn't feel good. And, ultimately it's going to be Joe Biden's decision if he stays on the ballot or not. But I don't feel any better today than I did last Friday, a day after the election, for a guy who does not want Donald Trump to be the next president.
Well, also a point you brought up before the show, too, because everybody's like, well, if he gets out, what happens? Well, what happens is the Democratic convention becomes a real convention where it's going to be a real competition. But who's showing up there, right? I mean, who's showing up to that convention? Because, I mean, it's a lot of expense to travel from all over the country to, where is it being held again? I'm forgetting now.
It's in Chicago.
In Chicago. Republicans are in Milwaukee. They're in Chicago. Which, by the way, the historical portent for that is kind of interesting. But
interesting is a nice way to put that. I think it's interesting and concerning if you're a Democrat. I mean,
sure.
We don't want history to repeat itself.
Not that history, anyway.
No.
Not that history. But it's basically where, I mean, who's going to show up at that convention to make it be competitive? I mean, if it's really going to be competitive and it's really going to determine who the candidate is, then who knows what's going to come of that? Now, I will say one thing, and I was talking to a friend, and the point I made is that if Democrats handle this the right way, that there could be a positive outcome, right? Where you have a real competition and you kind of have America on the edge of its seats. You're going to be sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Trump's not going to be able to get any headlines. I mean, I'm sure he'll try, but I mean, everybody's going to be focused on this. Somebody could emerge from that process with a lot of enthusiasm behind them. Now, the problem is it's just as likely that it goes completely off the rails and it becomes a nightmare and results in a party that's even more divided than it is now.
But if you do it in a thoughtful way, where the candidates aren't attacking each other, you also probably get Donald Trump to be doing more Trump-like stuff to try to get attention, right? I mean, he might go off the deep end a little bit trying to get attention if everybody's focused on the Dems. But I also mentioned to you, I mean, the folks that get elected to be DNC delegates in a lot of these states, especially in a year like this where there's no competition, like nobody was fighting, like the Clinton delegates were not trying to get elected over the Biden delegates or whatever. It's just sort of who wanted to go and who could afford to go and whatever. I don't, generally the people who go to the DNC are people who are activists on the left, just like the people who go to an RNC or the state Republican convention. It's not necessarily it's more activists than it is sort of rank and file Democrats.
And could a convention filled with very activists, I would argue probably very progressive Democrats, choose a candidate who's going to be able to beat Trump in Ohio?
Or I would be more, well, first of all, Trump's going to win Ohio. That's not even
okay. That's true. I'm still living in the before times when Ohio was a swing state.
But my bigger concern, would they choose somebody who's not a good candidate, or would they create a process that is so unorganized and so like, couldn't you just see, like, the Dems go through a process, they pick a candidate, Walz, Gretchen Whitmer, all these different options out there. And then you've got 10% of sort of the far left wing who just causes chaos at the convention. And you lose all that momentum that you've gained over the previous weeks. It's just a chancy proposition, but I also think it's even more chancy proposition just to roll like nothing has changed over the last week.
I think going the route of going to the convention and trying to find an alternative candidate. I mean, at this point, Joe Biden, I don't think can win this election. I don't think he can. I think the die's been cast, and it wasn't just a one-off event. We've had months and months and months of concern about his health that Democrats were dismissing, and it turns out a lot of the concerns were righteous, and now we have, basically in-your-face confirmation for a huge audience of Americans where they all watched it and it looked concerning. And I don't think the candidate's capable of putting that toothpaste back in the tube. His goose is cooked. If I were Democrats, at least roll the dice. Give yourself a chance. Maybe it backfires, but you got to do something.
But I think the other thing at play here that people aren't talking enough about is the effects that Biden being on the top of the ticket means for U.S. Senate races. I mean, we've got red states like John Tester, Sherrod Brown, and other places. I mean, West Virginia is already gone. That those people are going to have a real tough. I mean, it's already a tough race. It becomes even impossible if there's somebody that weak at the top of the ticket. What does that mean for the House? It's a chancy. I think you use the term hubris. If Biden stays on and Republicans take over all three, the president in both chambers of Congress.
With a Supreme Court ruling in his back pocket that says he can do whatever he wants to as long as it's under the color of official duties.
Yeah, it's probably time for folks to be thinking bigger than just the current president. But again, it's going to, like we've said before, Joe Biden's going to have to make this decision.
He's the only one that can. Nobody can force him out. I mean, people are talking about the 25th. Nobody's going to invoke the 25th Amendment.
Not a chance. Not this close to an election.
So it's, and if they did, he would fight it, and that would set up a food fight, and then the timeline's screwed anyway. So the only person who can do this for Democrats is Joe Biden, and I don't know that he has the humility to do it.
Yeah, and I don't know that either. And those scenarios all lead to the 34-time felony convicted guy getting reelected to be president.
We're going to end it there. Remember, I just want to remind people, no podcast on Friday after the holiday. We're taking a break. We'll be back next week.
Whoa. Are you going on vacation, Rob?
No, I'm hanging out. I'll be watching fireworks and stuff with my kids. I never leave mine on. I went on, my vacation was to West Fargo. That's as
Wait, hold on 1 second. So if I miss a show, I'm on vacation. You miss a show, you're spending time with your family.
Because if I miss a show, we just don't do a show, and you don't have the opportunity to drag me through the mud. I mean, for as much as I joke Chad or rib Chad about this, he's not going on vacation. He's working. He graciously takes time out of his schedule to do this podcast with me. So I do really appreciate that. But yeah, no show on Friday. I hope you all have a wonderful 4th of July. Thanks for listening. And
Happy 4th.